Hello, welcome to the Squarebase Show, where we are revealing even more information about our massive survey today on Squarebase with Rob and Val. Hello, everybody. Hello.
That's right.
Yeah.
Hello, Rob. Hello, everyone.
Hello, everybody. Yes. So, following up the last time we broke down the information from a massive survey, and if you don't know, we put a massive survey out with over 4,000 people. 4,000 people responding, and so we're going to be breaking down some more of this information, which has been put together, and it's very, very exciting. Today, we're going to be covering like buying trends and how people like get into the game via purchasing. Right.
That's right. We're going to talk about some favorite faction data. We're going to talk about how where you come from affects that choice, how people are actually acquiring models, some interesting stuff around all of that. Actually, this is one of my favorite sections of the survey. So hopefully you guys get a kick out of it as well.
Okay, sweet. So what is it about this section of the survey that's got you so personally excited? What's most interesting? Why should we be watching for the next hour and 45 minutes? What's super pumped about it?
I think this gives a little insight into some of the main concerns, maybe, if that's one way to put it. Like, what's the impact of the 9 core factions versus the 7 legacy? What's the impact of the fact that a lot of people already have tons of armies? Does that mean no one's buying anything? What about 3D printing? How does that factor into this? Is 3D printing ruining Warhammer? Is it dominating everything? I think that's the kind of stuff that we have some actual data around that maybe we've never had before. Okay,
super fun. Let's get into it, shall we? So if we look at our first page, do you want to take us through these elements?
Like I said, this is we're just gonna hit up some opportunities and limitations. I want to also shout out here Richard Manklow, who is a consultant with Pathway UX Research. Reached out, provided a lot of, this is probably our first content that features somebody like this, but reached out, is a professional in this field to help with the analysis and the cutting up of the data. Unfortunately, he wasn't involved in the creation of the actual survey. Luckily, a blind squirrel can indeed find a nut from time to time. So the survey did have, I think, enough good questions to have some, actual data that you can derive some conclusions from. But he definitely helped me with this presentation and with the analysis, and so shout out to him. Check the description below if you like the work and if you're looking for a research consultant.
Oh, fun.
That's the plug.
That's fun.
Yeah.
I am looking for a research consultant. That's what I want. Researching for me, sir.
So yeah, we can move along from here over to as this is a done by a professional. I thought it was important to highlight some opportunities and limitations here. So one thing that he does highlight is that the outreach was, from a sample size perspective, pretty good. He estimates the margin of error is plus or minus 3%, or less than 3%, considering other factors. Something to always bear in mind that this is, we have to take care of representation and honesty in this. Just the fact that who we are and the fact that we said we're running a survey probably means that the sample is largely comprised of people. Whoa, pardon me. The sample is probably comprised of people who are part of our audience, or might jive a little bit with our perspectives. But it was broadly
really cool people.
Really cool, like BAST people.
Yeah.
But beyond that, it was shared quite widely through various social media platforms. So as I said on the previous episode, think of this as a survey of the people who really care a lot about Warhammer: The Old World, right? So this would be the folks who have opinions, man. And there's over 4,420 of them. So that was pretty cool. And one thing that he wanted to point out was not all questions were phrased neutrally, and this potentially reduced comprehension and reliability. And that was my failing as a survey writer. Future versions will improve. But again, that wasn't all the questions. So we can move on.
Okay. All right. Let's do so. So faction preferences, good and evil. We kept the good and evil. I thought this week we got rid of this.
Good. Well, I mean, GW has them. This is how the 9 core factions are divided up.
I didn't know they took it down after we criticized them, right? I think.
I don't know, man. They are good v evil because the old alignments are AOS now. So the old alignments, which were, what was it? The forces of good, the forces of destruction, and then neutral.
Neutral. Yeah. But
I think neutral had a different word.
Yeah.
So yeah, now it's just good and evil. And then of course there's the seven PDF factions in there as well. So we can move on into
Oxy Goblins are just trying to live. I'm not having them be in evil. I'm out. I don't, and you cannot convince me that the high elves are good. But here we are.
And as a feudal system and means of organizing your society, Britannia, not in some ways evil. I don't know. It's hard to know for sure. Mm-hmm. So here we go. We're going to break out the favorite factions before we get into details, just to have a look to see how the rough breakdown is. So I think it comes out fairly close to sort of just the percentage of total factions works out to be roughly where things are. So when we're looking just at the overall breakdown, this is the percentage of people who are obviously playing or identify, these factions as being their favorite. And right now, 32% of people view the legacy factions as their faves. Now, 44% of all factions are in fact legacy factions. So that's interesting. Whereas Forces of Fantasy and Ravening Hordes are coming in closer to where they would, arrive at if you just had an even distribution. So Ravening Hordes, about 25% of all the factions, obviously, 4 of 16. And then Forces of Fantasy, 5 of 16. They're a little overrepresented. So 31% of total factions, 45% of people say that one of those is their favorite. And one thing that I find pretty interesting is that Vampire counts were the most popular legacy factions. Mm-hmm. And then of those ones, they're all less than 5%. Dogs of War was on this survey, and that was because as I was writing it, I thought to myself, they used to have an army book in 5th edition. And this was sort of a survey of people who maybe had played any or all of the editions. Mm-hmm. People from Kislev pointed out that they did have a little mini army book actually in 6th. So I froze them out by accident.
Nice.
But anyway, so that's sort of a quick high-level overview of it. But yeah, Forces of Fantasy definitely are in the lead as far as anything. The good guys are the most popular.
That's actually really common, across all of their game systems. And I think it's a good conversation that maybe, quote unquote, the good guys are pretty popular in most game kind of universes or IPs and stuff like that. I would say though mm-hmm. that speaks to an overarching othering of especially quote unquote evil. They've immediately been like, these people are evil. Do you want to be evil? As opposed to we could break down the unbasked nature of fantasy and also the writing of it a lot, but yes. I'm unsurprised and will always expect to see the quote unquote ironically good guys to have a higher representation than others.
And I think that was, by the way, we touched on that. You touched on the previous slide. The good and evil thing was kind of annoying right off the hop, because one of the great things about Warhammer Fantasy and just the Warhammer thing in general is that there generally speaking isn't this a binary dichotomy of good versus evil. There is a lot of self-motivated, a lot of self-interested and self-motivated factions that do good and evil things. So that's why I think that oversimplification of that was a bit of a bummer. Out of the gates when the game was announced.
But, yeah, for sure. Yeah. But I also believe that that's why you always will see fantasy. I think there's a good conversation in the stuff that is in the legacy. It's vampire counts are good, so maybe just more people picked up vampires as an example. Readily available models, easy to get. So yeah, let's move on to the next slide.
All right, so here we go. This is the actual numbers behind the fave factions. And this is, again, so one thing that I wouldn't say deeply regret, but I did regret is that I didn't ask follow-up questions about favorite factions. And I think this would have also been a really good ranked ballot choice, because this is just off the hop. What's your favorite? Give us one of your 16 favorites. I think in future editions, I'd love to know what's your second favorite. What armies, if you say it's your favorite army, does it match up to the army you actually own? That's another good question. But anyway, the thing I also wanted to, I think that's kind of cool here, is just showing where the legacy or the renegade factions distribute on this list. And I'd say roughly they're, as popular or as unpopular as some of the core factions. And two of them, Ogre Kingdoms, Demons of Chaos, are right at the bottom. I was surprised by Ogres. I'm not going to lie. Again, maybe that's one of those favorite second factions. Because it strikes me as an army that was clearly built as sort of kind of like the way I think Knights are, or maybe the Giants are in AOS, or the Knights in 40K, just as a low model count army to get people into it. Like just something like if you want to just have some bash bros, you can bring them in. And it is the newest army as well, so maybe that has something to do with whether or not it's built up a lot of a fan fondness. But it was also interesting for me to see guys like Tomb King's way low on this at 3.6, Beastmen at 3%. But you see, I'd say the majority of the factions do have a sizable chunk of the overall base. And I don't know if you were to do this for 40K, although it's 40K is probably 50% power armor factions if they're chaos or different chapters and things. But you probably see a pretty Space Marine dominant spread. It is kind of cool that you have such a even distribution across what are very different sort of faction identities here.
Yeah, I think a lot of this is to do with marketing. I'm gonna say that a lot, and I'm gonna say that time and again. I think through this, I think ultimately some factions got so much more lip service, so much more love, or when upon release, like the problem with Beastmen, I think. For Beastmen is always been like nebulous. They're a Beastman, and like even when there's like they never really delve enough into like cultures, societies, like driving forces. It's just they're the bad guy, right? Chaos Dwarfs are a little bit more like a little bit more structured, I think. But ultimately, like Lizardmen, I'm unsurprised, which I think is wrong in this. It's meant to be a legacy one, just above Chaos Dwarfs. Yeah. But yeah, they had a whole backstory, super popular, and I'm unsurprised to see them be pretty popular. And then vampires also were just cool, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were just cool.
This is actually something that when I first saw this, I was really intrigued by, which is the fact that the most popular factions, and I don't know how to really describe them, like what the correct way to describe them. I might call them like your like traditional fantasy factions, or like your Tolkien-esque, or Tolkien-esque, or your D&D factions, which is where Warhammer came from. Humans, dwarfs, fancy elves, orcs, and goblins are dominant in the top of this list. And also, those are the exact factions that were just rejected by Age of Sigmar, which I think is kind of interesting. So maybe they're oversampled because the fans of this are also, there's not really a game where I guess you could play literally the Middle Earth strategy battle game. But for folks who want to play in a Warhammer world, this is where these guys are. There are new twists on these factions, obviously in AOS, but those top three were all sort of smooshed, if I recall correctly, into just Cities of Sigmar, right? And they didn't have a lot of uniqueness for a while.
The top two,
maybe I'm wrong.
The top two, for sure. Although there's two versions of dwarfs now. There's obviously KO and Fire Slayers, and I've talked about this a lot with Age of Sigmar. Age of Sigmar has got a braveness to it, I think, in that like it's creating its own fantasy universe versus just being like a Tolkien reskin. Which Warhammer Fantasy also eventually became a non-Tolkien-esque reskin as well, like with the introduction of a bunch of stuff that wasn't in Tolkien. So like I want to be clear, but yeah, you're right. D&D, Tolkien, all these things that are kind of like trad fantasy, and now we're seeing people explore outside of that. And I think it's good to see the old world back and kind of exploring those more traditional themes with twists, and then AOS doing its own thing again with those. But yeah, like meta representation, at least. Right now, the two most popular armies are like, your classics, Stormcast versus Slaves to Darkness. So, what we would call Warriors of Chaos. And dwarfs aren't really well. There are 2 dwarf armies you can collect, and
Yes.
there are. There's a High Elf army you collect, and there is an Empire army you can collect really in the cities, but the cities one is just not very popular at the moment.
As it sort of transitions to its own identity, though, like I think that's.
But I'm only using tournament data. Sorry, just to be clear, I'm not using a survey data. I think survey data and tournament data will tell us very different stories. Like your favorite faction, the faction you'll play at the weekend. Probably very different, because I think probably a question I would have loved in the survey is if you could have an individually painted heraldry Bretonnian army where each knight is a different heraldry, that you didn't have to paint. Would you want that?
Sure.
99% yes. Right. Well,
I mean, ultimately, that's one of the problems I have with fantasy is I have a fondness for just about all of these. They all have, and maybe that's part of Total War too, being able to like try them all on playing Total War or other ways online helps. But yeah, no, I just did think it was interesting that those are so far and away the top factions, and they do have that sort of traditional fantasy thing in common. And not that they don't exist in AOS, just that the actual traditional fantasy trope version of them doesn't really exist in AOS was kind of the point. It wasn't meant to be it just like as from like a like things on the shelf perspective for Games Workshop, Old World allows them to serve people who are into these kind of things, this flavor of stuff, more. And there's a lot of people like that out there.
And actually, I want to say that I think that that's both a good and a bad thing. It's like when you pick up you might read The Wheel of Time, and their magic system and, the characters and creatures that they have inside of it are very different to what you might read in Raymond E. Feist and to what you might read in, like, I don't know, like the Shannara series or something similar. Like they're all different magic systems, different universes, different ways that they do these things. But which means that like when you do have something that is not that's kind of cool and exciting because you get this unique thing away from the traditional, which is what we see in the old world. But you also miss the traditional. Sometimes you just want a dwarf who's drinking a beer with a beard, who's grumbly, and then you're like, "What?" And you're like, "Why do they do that?" And it's like, "That's what they do." That's what they do.
That's what it says on the tin with the dwarf, for sure.
That's for sure. So yeah, I think there's good and bads to all of it, right? And I think you're right. Go on.
That's good. I think we can probably move on. We've got a couple of slides that continue to break this down a little bit. And that are just cool to have a look at. Just how just maybe how things change up a little bit as you separate for being, for example, a Total War player versus a non-Total War player. How that might split up a little bit the faction percentages. But we can go through these. I think these are just sort of a for instance.
I think that there's not much big delineation between these, though, apart from Orcs and Goblins do stand out a little bit as having more non-Total War players, which I thought interesting. Everything else seems to be pretty solid, but Orcs and Goblins are just very much like, I'm an Orc and Goblin player. That's what I want. Because I would say I guess it's a good question to ask people who are watching this video. If you were to take someone who who's not a Warhammer fan, or you walked them into a store and they had each one of the factions available as miniatures to buy. What do you think is the most evocative? Which one stands out from the pages or the boxes as much? I feel like Orcs and Goblins always in there with a shout as being the most evocative one.
And I think actually, as you highlighted in the good and evil point, they don't read as evil.
No,
they read as they read as some lads to me. Like they look like a good time. Except for goblins. If you've ever read Skarsnik, you know that they're murderous, awful, just horrifying creatures. I have no love for actual goblins, just for the record. Skarsnik scarred me.
I know. You bring it up all the time. Like
harsh, man. Harsh.
I imagine you with a blanket over your shoulders and a cup of cocoa, and you're like, that was not fun.
I just always some fun-loving guys who like psychedelics, just like me. And turns out, no, a lot more into the murdering than I could have ever possibly imagined. And the skinning of dwarves. It's a bit intense. Skarsnik, though, great book. Loved it.
Loved it.
So we can move on. What do we have? We got new players versus returning players. It sort of just gives, again, a little split based on whether you're new to the game or returning to the game.
I think
we can keep on going.
Okay, okay, let's go. Favorite factions.
And then this was a little interesting. Another split based on did the additions have any sort of an impact on what you preferred? I was mostly interested to see how high elf split there, but I think overall not really. I think this one didn't return too much insight.
Okay, all right. Non-core factions.
And then here's some pretty nice little high level stats that came out of some of our questions. So 97. This is the number I wanted to see. 97.3%. That 0.3 is very important. Believe legacy factions should become core, i.e., legacy factions should one day be supported. The 7 there. Check out the Renegade Legacy Pack to hopefully make that dream a reality. And then 44.5% wouldn't mind an entirely new faction before legacy factions become core.
Well, they're getting that anyway.
Yes.
No choice.
But I think sometimes, I don't know, I guess this is shaped by my experience. I don't know if you remember when Custodes came out. So this is a faction for Warhammer 40,000. And they were in the middle of this like big new reboot of Warhammer of Warhammer 40K, as they pretty much always are. And Custodes out of nowhere gets dropped in the middle of it. And people were waiting for their thing, and suddenly there was a new army, and it seemed to really rub people the wrong way. So that made an impression on me. What this says to me is that, like, you know what? Like, all people want it to come, but it doesn't have to be tomorrow. Like, we're not unreasonable humans here. It's just, the legacy factions can come. Just, get around to them eventually. And then finally was a question of the rumored or anticipated things that could be new factions, like net new factions to the game. I believe we had Dogs of War, Kislev, Cathay, and there was a fourth one. Dogs of War, Kislev, Cathay.
Nippon?
No. Maybe
Araby?
there was just 3.
Okay.
Anyway, it doesn't matter too much, because what I expected was that Total War players would. What I expected, one, was like Cathay and Kislev would be far and away. Of all players surveyed, it was basically shared between 20% of each of those. Okay. Oh, Norska was the last one, right, and it had a very small fraction. The only one, and then I thought that amongst Total War players that you would see this big bump of interest in Cathay, actually didn't. But Total War did bump Kislev. So amongst people who participated in this survey anyway, like that the Total War had an impact maybe on the Kislevite favoritism. Cathay had definite interest, but it wasn't like jumping off the charts. Holy cow, can't wait for Cathay.
Yeah, I would have loved a follow-up question for the 97.3% believe legacy factions should become core. I guess the real question here is like, because obviously this is a conversation we're having behind the scenes, so to keep everyone in the loop, realistically, is that 97.3% like, I want Games Workshop to bring them into core, or as long as there are rules available for them to play with everyone else, like, even if they're done by fans or they're done by a committee or whatever the situation, how can they be played in the game in the future? Because I can't imagine a game of Warhammer Fantasy that doesn't have lizardmen, dark elves, demons, right? Like vampire counts. Because I spent my entire Warhammer Fantasy Battle career arguing my army was real. I was like, no, Chaos Dwarfs is up against Workshop, so they're real. And people are like, they're not, mate. And I'm like, it's got a book. It's in my hands. I can show you the pages.
Yeah. It's a nicer book than your book.
Yeah, it's a nicer book than your book, bitch. Yeah. So I can really understand the feeling that Legacy and Renegade faction players feel, because that was always my feeling in those days as well. But similarly, I'm sure there's a huge portion of people who maybe would respond negatively to be done by other people. But that's an interesting follow-up question I would like to have seen.
You know what, Rob? Yeah. You're a consummate host, because that's going to be in a future episode when we talk about gaming and other things. So we actually do have follow-up questions on that, so stay tuned.
Amazing. All right, well, that's the kind of big takeaway from this. We're at the end of this, no? Or no, we keep going?
Yeah, we'll keep going.
Okay.
The next one is also, I think, pretty interesting. So buying into the old world. This is going to be about miniatures and where we get things, what armies people had before. This is pretty cool.
Okay. All right, sweet. So old world, new forces. Ooh, good title.
So this is a chart here, just sort of breaking down of the 4,420 people, just on a high level, what sort of things did everyone do? So 80% of people of this in this survey purchased at least one new thing, which is pretty cool. What's also particularly mind blowing is 70%, 69.5% started a new army. 70, basically 1% already owned at least one existing Warhammer Fantasy Battle army at release. So obviously there's that's not complete overlap there, but it is interesting. It is interesting to think that and we'll see more as we go along, that like owning stuff already, which was a big concern. Like, why would you release this game? The only people who are going to care are the people who already have armies, like myself. And actually that doesn't really pan out at all. 40%, so 41% or so of the respondents started a core army, and 29% of them started a legacy army. So even though they were told, do not, so this is people who didn't necessarily already own them, they were told, do not start this army, do not do this. These rules are just for fun. We put them out here for no apparent reason. People still felt like they liked them enough to start them on faith, essentially.
Yeah, 30% is a wild number.
Big number.
That's a big number. A third of the player base started a new legacy army. That's crazy. Like, it's just because in their heads it's not. Like, I think, like, can I just say that I feel there's a bunch of people out there, and listen, I'm on your side, and I feel exactly the same feeling. There's a ton of people out there who are just like, there's no way that they won't be allowed in the game in the future. Like, it feels like an impossible thought, right? And I feel like most of us, even if it's a delusion, even if it's like we're lying to ourselves, whatever, I feel like it seems silly, like that would ever be the case.
That they wouldn't come back?
That they wouldn't come back. Like,
yeah. And I think and again, we'll have future episodes on both the sort of the data we have on opinions around it, as well as what, I've been working on to do something about it. But I think something that's really important to consider is that, when you're an artist, man, when you create something and you put it out into the world, there's a thing where you kind of lose control of it, right? Mm-hmm. Even if you own IP and you can C&D people, you can do all these kind of things, you can bully folks and you can try and make it, force people into your walled garden, however you want to do it. Ultimately, whether it's how it's interpreted or how it's actually put to use, when you create something, you put it in the world, it's out of your control. Mm-hmm. And I think as customers, we can take them at their word and say, it's not part of their vision, man. Skaven are just like, they're under the ground. Okay. Vampires are somewhere else. They've disappeared. Dark elves are just not that into stealing living beings and turning them into laborers. So, we can buy that, or we can say, no, actually, we're your customers and we want these things. So, and as long as I think we've seen that a lot, Games Workshop, although they maybe aren't the best at maximizing the amount of money they can take from us by doing fan service all the time, ultimately they do get to fan service. Ultimately, they do respond to what customers would like. And I think we saw this, I've seen this in every single game system. And I think a really good example as a for instance of this is Blood Bowl. I think Rob brings up Blood Bowl all the time for its community and its player base. It's the same studio, but I'm talking about the Blood Bowl community. So the Blood Bowl community supported Blood Bowl, grew the game, grew the player base, and also added teams, as well as provided new rules for teams, kept those teams alive. And those are teams that we are now seeing Games Workshop support with official models. And these are things that came from the community of players. So again, if we just say, I get what you're saying, Games Workshop, I see what you're trying to do here. I understand there might be some sort of weird internal balance thing going on about what armies Old World gets to use, but no, thank you. We would like the legacy armies.
The schism.
I think I think we'll eventually get them as long as we don't let them say no. That's it.
Yeah. Fair. I agree as well. I think, again, they're easily bullyable and they love fan service. So, and that department do like, say what you like about SDS. I think that there's nothing but shackles on their hands. They like the game, which is pretty crazy. I think there are portions against Workshop where the creators are just like, this is my job. But I think in SDS and the old world writers, they're people who like the thing. And I think that's cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there was so just to wrap this up, there was logistic reasons, right? Like releasing 16 factions is a lot of stuff, right? They would have taken time to do it anyway. So someone would have had to be first and someone would have had to be last. But I think we also know that there's weird internal stuff around who owns what IP, basically, and which departments get to use the schism, which departments get to use what minis. And we're going to blow a little bit of that up as we look at purchasing behavior. But anywho, so here we go here. We're looking at players with existing armies. I don't know about that top bar. However, yeah, because I don't think 86% pathway. So basically here, I was blown away by how many players actually already had armies. Yeah, 86% of the player base did not previously have 0 previous armies. Oh no, this is that they owned it, not that they played. No, that's not true either. I apologize. Okay, so what we're looking at here on this chart is essentially the percentage of responses of people who are starting any new army split by the number of armies already owned by the respondent at release. So what does that mean? So this is everyone in this chart started a new army, and most of them did not have an army at release. However, the people who did have armies, up to 3 or more of those armies, they still started a new army, which is crazy.
Wait, so I had 3 armies. Old World came out, and 61% of people still started a 4th army.
Yes, sir.
You are all. I'm going to look directly into the camera. You're all insane. You're all insane. You already know how hard it is to build and paint an army, and you are like, I'm gonna do it, you motherfucker. You are crazy. That's insane.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yes, that's kind of what because that was, I think, a big question. Like, are people actually going to engage with this because it's just new rules? And I think there was an argument that, before Old World was really defined and the release strategy was identified by GW, like some people assumed it was just going to be a rule book. They weren't even sure models would come out, all that kind of stuff. Because of course, like the models weren't selling before. Why would they sell now?
Yeah.
And I think that's a valid question. We can keep going.
All right, buddy. All right, let's do this.
I'm not looking at the right page.
Okay, well, we're talking about model acquisition tendencies. Okay.
So this is a bit. This looks a little bit goofy, but bear with me here. So this is basically, where do people get their models from? And if there's a juicy slide in all of this, I think this is perhaps the most interesting one.
The juiciest.
This is quite juicy. So the way we had it broken down was basically buying Old World kits from Old World kits from I
just want that as a soundbite now. I just want to be quite juicy.
Quite juicy.
Sorry. Carry on. It just made me laugh.
I get excited about graphs and charts.
I'm excited too. It's a laugh of endearment. I don't know how else to show it.
I get it. And there are some people who are laughing at me. Some people are like, stop laughing at him. All right, I get it. Regardless, and it's also sales data, which for some people are probably like, why is this the most interesting chart again, Val? But here, let me try and sell it on you. So one thing is, we were talking about this idea of the schism, right? We were talking about this concept of they don't want to cross-pollinate necessarily between different channels of Games Workshop. So we saw this first with 40K and the Horus Heresy. You use most, but not all, of your Horus Heresy models in 40K supported with rules. At the start of 10th edition, they cut that link. They made any rules sort of not officially supported in 40K that were strictly Horus Heresy models. So that way, if you're buying a Horus Heresy model, that means it's for Horus Heresy, or at least that's what their hope is. And then when Old World came, we saw a similar split between Old World and AOS. So is that split working? We can't definitively say, but we're going to get a little insight here. And then the other thing too is, where are people getting their kits from? Because a lot of stuff is out of print. And there's also things like 3D printing out there. There's recasts. So where does all this stuff come from? So of our respondents, obviously the majority of kits that were bought were like kits from Games Workshop. That's either through trade or through GW. Just of our audience, it looks like the majority of people like to get their stuff through the trade channel. So that would be like a third party, like a hobby store. There you go. Yeah, a third party retailer, like a hobby store. And of those, what are we looking at there? We're looking at 37% of that would be just actual Old World kits. So people buying new sculpts for their armies, actual Old World kits, somewhere around 40%. And then you have somewhere around 18 or 19% are Age of Sigmar kits. Mm-hmm. So again, we're getting a lot of uptake of Age of Sigmar kits to fill out or make Old World armies. But nonetheless, a good chunk, a plurality of things are coming from the Old World kits. Then you have a big source, which is secondhand Warhammer Fantasy kits, which was 15%. So that's the used market that people can buy. A pretty surprisingly high number, I think.
I think it's because in some cases, like, it's all you could buy, right?
Oh yeah, no, sorry, I was just about to finish. I was going to say recast at 5% of all minis that people get is pretty wild to me. Maybe that's just all Australia, but that's a pretty high number. That 5% is, and a recast would be like a unlicensed reproduction of like a Games Workshop sculpt. So overall, we're looking at somewhere around 75-80% of models being used originated somehow with Games Workshop, with about 50% of those being actually from the company itself. The rest is either secondhand or just bootlegs. And then we get into the more nebulous area. So third-party kits are at about 6%. So that would be like a games company that sells retail.
Like Mantic or something.
Mantic, Warlord Games, or any other purveyor of fantasy or fantasy-adjacent models. And then finally, 3D prints. Mm-hmm. This is, I think, the coolest insight, which is, again, I don't know if you consider this big or small, but what would that be? Almost 17% of people are using 3D prints, and that's broken out into at home versus through a service. Mm. The bigger one is is through a service, which I found interesting.
I would say, like, actually, there's some interesting things here, like, that I would like to talk about. I think number one, the third-party kits being lower than 3D printing is a massive problem for the companies that have set themselves up as a cheaper alternative to Games Workshop, right? Mm-hmm. Because already they've been eclipsed, right? So that's pretty massive. The follow-up is that I would say that you would have that number of 3D printing be higher if there was more reliable and consistent services. So I know a couple of people that 3D print stuff. So there's Tom, Carly, and there's also Toby, who I know, who 3D print stuff for people. And as far as I'm aware, they are just constantly full-time running prints for people, to a really high volume. But I don't think that they have a sales issue. I think they have a capacity issue. Right. So I think there's a lot of people, and let us know in the comments below if this is your case, where you would happily get some 3D prints, but you don't know someone who's reliable who can give you a good 3D print. I imagine that number would actually be higher. Either way, losing 20% of your sales for your game system is a devastating, that's obviously third-party kits and 3D prints combined. 20% of your sales for your system. Well, I mean, secondhand Warhammer Fantasy Battle Kits means actually you're looking at more like 35%. Recast is taking us up to 40%. So they missed out on 40% of model sales for this edition. That's so that. I don't like, you work in the executive world more than I do, but I'm sure that several people get fired at 40%. I think people get fired at like 10%. I think.
So this is actually a really great. I think this is a really great conversation piece, which is what we don't know is why, right? I would say that often I think this is pricing related. Some of it would be quality related, although we did see in a previous survey previous episode about the survey that like old models did not seem to be a big turnoff for people. But just by the fact that like 18+% of people are using Age of Sigmar to fill out their kits, fill out their selections, might suggest that maybe the older models are a bit of an issue. Price point wise, the third party kits versus 3D prints, I think is probably a function of opinions too, right? And whether or not exactly what you want is available. So the people who are making those third party kits for other games, be they Mantic or others, is like they're going to have very specific models for their vibe. When you go into the world of 3D printing, you can find exactly what you want.
Exactly. Yeah.
And if you can't find exactly what you want, you can have someone make exactly what you want. You know what I mean? It provides for a lot of customization, right? And so yeah, I think 3D prints is a pretty big bite there. I'm most surprised by recast because it's a black market, like, so for black market stuff to be identified as being 5.3%, that's pretty wild. Secondhand kits doesn't surprise me because again, a lot of these factions just weren't available. You had to get them either for resale or whatever. I think we have a couple more charts that go through some of the sort of breakdowns. I think we break this down in some other ways. So let's have a look.
I'd like to have a look, but I'd also just like to shout out I think if I take recasts and 3D prints together at like nearly 20%, I just want to say shout out to the 20% of old world fans doing a bit of criminal work. Love you. It's what oils the world. You keep going. All right, let's make 30%. I want to see for next year. Please continue.
I was actually. I don't know if we can back up. You did ask the corporate question there, which is if you're giving up 40% of your potential market to competitors, is that a problem? It's only a problem if you're a monopoly. We are talking about like they still have a massive market share of all models bought. So they are without a doubt making the best margins on those models. So they're making the most money off of them. You're not going to be able to get rid of secondhand sales. That's one of the cool things about Warhammer is it does have a very vital resale market. But this does make me wonder, like, what are ways that you can mitigate for recasts and 3D prints, and then just outright other physical model manufacturers? But you're already taking a massive market share. Regardless of all those things. Sorry, let's move on.
Okay. Legacy Army starters by Games Workshop kits. Interesting.
Yeah, so this was just an interesting thing. Like, so if you were starting a legacy faction, how were you sourcing the models? And then this is essentially people who answered that they started an army and that they had bought new kits. How did they rate that? And then that was like, most people bought old world kits for the purposes of starting a new army. And then there were people who bought new sculpts only or a few new kits. But by far and large, the biggest volume of new kits being bought were by people starting new armies. And I guess on the legacy army side of things, yes, they were still buying old world kits, even though they were starting legacy factions. Maybe speaks to them starting more than one faction as well. But yeah.
Okay, that one's interesting for sure. Should we move to the next one?
Yeah, sure. And yeah, this is the one where actually I think it speaks more to the buying behavior of legacy army starters. So again, this is when you purchase models, where you tend to get them from. So when starting any new army, again, that you're seeing that 38% old world kits, 19% AOS kits split, and then you have your, what is that? Almost 40. Sorry, that'd be 30, almost 45, 40 something percent of people outside of GW. On the Legacy Army side of things, their split is almost identical as far as how much models they're buying from outside of GW, but they are simply shifting their old world purchases over to AOS kits to sort of fill that gap, which is kind of interesting. And then you see just like the baseline. So essentially, like the Legacy Armies are in effect sort of breaking the concept of splitting things out. People are just finding a way to make those armies.
Yeah. I think also like there's always the great big question around like availability at the launch of the edition, right? Where I think what we're seeing is a larger, more involved player base now in 2025 than we had at the beginning of 2024. But you had obviously that initial hype in 2024 at the launch of the game and not a lot of stuff available. I think now people are kind of trickling in with each new army book, with each new thing that's popular. Based on the information that we had earlier, the two most popular factions have been released in 2025. High Elves and Empire. No, Dwarfs are probably second. We're second, actually. So we had first and third. So, we might be in a position where actually
a year from now,
2025 has been the year where people are like popping and buying everything. So you got an even bigger player base, an even bigger community, and that growth is pretty big. And then obviously people jump in when Cathay gets released, when everything else gets released as well. I think you're going to see these numbers. But at the beginning, there was obviously like nothing was available. So I think that's maybe really warped what this looks like.
I think that's actually really good insight. That's a thing we could have led with, and maybe supported by the next slide, where we look at exactly that. What impact did having a released army versus an unreleased army have on things, and as far as what your purchasing behaviors are. And again, this might be people buying multiple armies because, this is basically just relating their favorite faction to whether or not it was released at the time of this survey. But you can see like overall, aside from a shifting of a little bit from like old world kits to AOS, that sort of roughly, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more, 60-40 split is sort of firmly established there. And I think you have a very good point. Like actions that were in the second half of that release drop. One thing I do remember on the sort of whether or not a faction was popular or not, like Bretonnia and Tomb Kings overperformed with new players as far as their favorite faction is concerned, because they were the release factions, right? And then and so like when we come back and redo this, and I think this question is good enough that we can actually just redo it. I will be very interested to see if that share of like all model sales is even higher for Games Workshop amongst players, because I think you make a really good point. They just haven't had a lot of time to gobble these up. When the survey went out, High Elves hadn't even gone up for sale. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, like I anecdotally had someone literally yesterday in the US just be like, Rob, just picked up the High Elf book. This has been my army. I've been waiting a year for it.
Yeah.
What do I get? And I'm just like, okay. I think that's just going to be pretty common. People are like, I'm just going to wait for my time to shine, and here I am. Pretty concerned about those release queues at the stores for Beastmen. Very different vibe, the Beastmen people to the High Elf people. Different energy that they're bringing.
Different energy.
Yeah.
We're gonna see. We're gonna have to see how that breaks out. And this is, by the way, this next one is people who 3D print. And what I wanted to get an idea here is like, how did 3D print users differ in their buying habits from people who don't 3D print, or either from a service or themselves. And the black bar is people who 3D print, and the red bar is people who don't. So they do straight up buy slightly less from GW and third-party retailers as far as kits are concerned. They buy a little bit more secondhand. Interesting. They buy a little bit more AOS, which is interesting. And they buy more other models, and they buy a lot more recasts. So this says to me that, at least in part, people who 3D print is probably somewhat economic. So, like, is it cheaper? If you're buying from a service, I think you will learn very quickly it's not that much cheaper than official kits. I think if you see the fact that they're still buying from AOS, people who carry AOS stuff, this could just be a matter of taste. So this could be your argument here. If that 15% of the market means that your models are competing against really well sculpted models that are modern looking, dynamic, can compete with modern day GW plastic kits, and that you're running older kits against them, aesthetically, you might just be losing that competitive battle.
Yeah, we could have called this section the ugly truth, right? Like the ugly truth is a bunch of those old ass models are ugly. Like, and especially for new people, returning people, or people transitioning from other systems. Why would they pick up that fugly model? Listen, if you loved that model back in the day and you're like, nah, I like it, but ultimately it doesn't stick for modern sculpting, or as good as modern sculpting. And even then, modern sculpting art is subjective. Like, you know, you can release the latest. Just did a Jugs episode, which is a podcast that I do on the side, and then we went through the different Primarchs, like which one of the two, you know, the Games Workshop kit, the main or the SDS kit, and ultimately they're different themselves as well, right? So you can even have literally the same company making the same character in two different formats, and people are divided on which one looks better. So, the aesthetics are probably the most important, but they should be one of the most important elements, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is a game of aesthetics, right? Yeah. Like, you can play this game with paper, pieces of paper cut up on a table. You can play it online. The ones that invest time and effort into it and create armies is because it looks cool, right? Yeah. Fundamentally, that's part, like an essential part of the game. Sure. So how those things go, and I think so. Aesthetics is definitely one thing you can drive from that. If we can just go back for 1 second, but I also don't want to skip that pricing is also important. So again, people who 3D print also buy more recasts, and they also buy more secondhand. So I think it's a combination. Those are probably two buckets that, if you were a corporation who this mattered to, you might drill into a little bit and find out how you can win that business. And by the way, the answer isn't sue everybody, Games Workshop. The answer is, how do you compete to win these guys over? Because they're already your customers. They like your game. So just go win them. Go win them. Compete for them. Okay? That's all I'll say.
Directions confused. I've already cease and desisted 10 people. Lawyer stopping as he's typing, watching the show. He's just like, what?
Okay. All right, cool. Yeah. You guys got to go win the business now. Okay. All right. What do we got?
Who tended not to get Games Workshop kits?
Okay, yeah, here we go. So 17% of people using 3D printed models. So again, still capture people who can just make models in their garage or order them from somewhere else. Still, 83% of them or so are getting Games Workshop stuff. Secondhand models, people using recasts, only 12. So of everyone who responded, 4,420, there's only 12.5% that just didn't buy anything. So that's actually a really important number there. So like there's 12.5% of people just didn't buy anything. So like that says to me that there's a lot of room to like yes, you're losing some, but there's still a massive share of what people are buying, and then using other models. So again, it feels like it's stuff that it's not something that most people. I think people think of 3D printing and recast and all that kind of stuff as it's everything. People buy, like, 3D print their entire army. The vibes I'm getting here is that people are picking and choosing what they're 3D printing, what they're buying from Games Workshop, what they're getting secondhand. They're really assembling, and this speaks to my collection, by the way. This is exactly how my collection is assembled. It's a combination of everything, right? And whether or not I choose Games Workshop and a new kit, is dependent on a lot of other factors, including what are alternatives that are available. So.
Yeah, for sure. Like currently, I'm looking at doing an Orc and Goblin army for Old World, right? And I know I can pick up some minis from Games Workshop. Ultimately, a lot of goblins is a 3D printed dream. But I do love the new Doom Diver. Don't think it would fit on the base that you need it for Old World. But I think the new Doom Diver from GW is great, but it is so expensive. There's like immediately I just noped out on it, and I was like, there's not a world where that's going to be something I pick up. Like I think that there's a variety of factors that really, inform your decision on why you pick up where. And having different options though is great for the consumer base compared to where we were in the past.
True. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually also helpful for growing. I think there's a whole either essay style or like just Squarebase show style episode on pricing, and looking at old world internally versus other things. Like you just described the Doom Diver, and like AOS sculpts are nicer, no doubt. They're a lot more expensive than your standard old world kit, which is interesting. So where do people 3D print the most? So more than 50% of printing is greater than 50% of 3D printing is in Australia, France, New Zealand, Spain, Poland, and Italy. So that's, again, we're guessing here. Only GW stockists would know, but this might come down to supply as well, right?
Correct.
So how available are these things where 3D printing is prevalent? Because you look at the lightest green territories are the UK, the United States and Canada. We're all sort of on the average or slightly below the average of 3D printers. But a place like Australia, which is hit with not only shortages all the time, like almost every old world release has been delayed severely for Australia. But on top of that, Australia and New Zealand have what I could only describe as the worst pricing out of everybody. Is Australia workshop prices most of their market out, so they overrepresent quite reasonably. Like it's quite predictable that they would overrepresent 3D printing and recast adoption in Australia, because if you want to participate in Games Workshop stuff for no apparent reason, you're paying almost double. So there you go.
Yeah, of course. They're just economically pushed out. Also, there's been a really big trend, like when the heresy was a big thing in Australia, and I'm sure it still is in certain areas. But I know for a fact that they were just very blasé about it. They were like, "Yeah, we're just going to buy it all from China. Like China's just there. It's cheaper. Like the tax that they put on the plastic kits is added to the Forge kits. So they were just outrageous. They were like, we're not paying for that. We're just gonna." And good on them. I really think, like, if companies just saying you got to pay more for no reason, then if you want to play the game, you should play the game. A lot of people are probably screaming at their computers. What do you mean no reason? It's Australia. You got to ship it there. It takes forever. All this stuff. So before we get there, first of all, yes, okay. Australia has different import duties, and all sorts of stuff that affects the prices of goods in Australia. Sure, the distance to get it there, the relative size of the market. Sure, also true. However, the real driver of this, and you can see this supported also in the fact that horse heresy was really popular in Australia. One of the reasons why that is that for a long time, Forge World was priced in British pounds, only British pounds. It was not priced in like the web card. If you went there, it was GBP, which means you got the real-time exchange rate on resin. You did not get real-time exchange rate on plastics. The reason for that is somewhere around 2009, 2010, GW went to a constant currency calculation. All right. So what that means is they basically, GW created an exchange rate for all the currencies they operate in, and that's what they price at. And they did that the year before there was a commodities crash, and the strength of the Australian dollar dropped significantly. And so right now, GW prices are priced and have never really been, they never really went back to correct this, but GW prices are way higher in Australia because it's based on a constant currency that no longer is there. This was alleviated a little bit by Brexit and other things, but fundamentally, it's just bad pricing strategy. That is the only reason. And they also struggle to distribute to Australia, another reason. So again, you want to win the business of Australia, normalize your pricing strategy there, make them at least in line and reflective of, sure, the costs of selling to Australia, but you're essentially driving a very active other customer base like Canada
like any individual country in Europe, you're driving them to buy Chinese recasts made out of gasoline and 3D print. So there you go. Fix your strategy.
Yeah. Also, like Games Workshop, as we know, is a company that really does not understand markets in any way. Like, for instance, they make Space Marines. People buy Space Marines. And then they don't make orcs, and no one buys orcs. And then they say to themselves at the end of the year, they're like, Space Marines are popular. We should make more Space Marines. And you're like, did you take into account that you didn't release any orcs? Because that would have affected it. And they'll be like, I don't know what you're saying. Make some more Space Marines. Until you get into an almost insane cycle of self-reference, which I'm sure would be the case here. Australians aren't buying much. Then it doesn't matter if we try harder to sell more in Australia.
Why bother?
Why bother? So like, there's they're really poorly constructed. This has been fascinating, and we are going to be doing another show about gaming, which is not going to be now. But this has been super interesting. Have you enjoyed it?
I think that's one for the comments. Did you enjoy that?
Yeah.
What questions do you guys have? Because of course I enjoyed it. I have enjoyed this whole process, Rob, from the writing of the survey, the excitement of people like engaging with that survey, being very suspicious of me stealing their data, the process of people reaching out. There was, by the way, the first show we did on this was a guy named HK, who was also a specialist in doing analysis of surveys, who just reached out and helped me parse those slides and that data. And we're just getting, help from our community both in providing us these answers, because you don't have to do that, and then also help from community in chopping them up and understanding what we got. Again, this package was brought to you by Richard Manclow, and you can get a description for his hard work. Unfortunately, this was an exposure job, but he did volunteer, so there you go.
Yeah, we didn't ask him; he asked. So there you go. Shout out to Rich; he's done a great job. I think this has been interesting. I don't think many of it is overly a surprise, to be honest. But I think like understanding everyone, and then also, I think for some people watching this who might be new, again, comments, let us know you are new, and like actually, this has made me rethink my purchasing avenues and choices. This has made me, process like what I've been doing or what I plan on doing, or I think all of it is really interesting, because like everyone your local gaming club, you get together and be like, oh, where did you get your kits from, or bought them secondhand? And I think a lot of people get into those communities. Some people are also really isolated as well. They don't have a gaming group, or they're watching this and they're just person on their own who's super excited about Old World. They want to go to events, but like, I don't have any friends. I don't know where to play. I don't have any friends who play the Old World or whatever. So there's a lot of separation in our community, because while there's lots of people playing and it's super exciting, it's great to have people who watch this show, connecting all those dots and that sinew of what we are as a community is really cool. And I know for a fact that a lot of people will talk about, which I think is really good. Like, I think that's a really good convo. Like, just keep everyone engaged. Games Workshop don't have an Old World community manager. They just don't have that. So, which is weird. Not having a game, like a community manager for your game system, is it's Luddite work. It's we're talking. You're talking. You're decades behind.
Rob? Who are we?
You're decades behind. You're decades behind. It's truly insane.
It's interesting, and I think I'll just drop it at that. I think it's very interesting. Remember too, we are at the time of the survey, about 1 year into the original strategy of what Games Workshop was thinking would work for Old World, and I think this is reflective of that strategy performing beyond their expectations, and therefore not meeting, I think, certainly in the case of the product situation, not meeting the needs of the customers that they had, because I don't think they realized that they had what they had when they were launching it. So obviously they have stated at some point that the scope has changed, and we got reasons to be excited for the future. But they definitely overshot their runway, and as a result, I think we see the splits that we saw there, and they can do better. Like they have customers, guys. They have customers. We don't have to worry about this game. This game is spicy. People like it. People people want to buy stuff. I think that's also a key thing there. People who had 3 armies, 61% of them bought a 4th.
Yeah. I think,
that's nuts.
Yeah, it's nuts. It's nuts. And I think it really talks to the health of the game and the excitement of the community. I know, like, I'm already racing. I'm going to be racing to my keyboard to start typing up the thing I want to talk about with getting new people into the game. Just one of the things I want to work on this week. So super exciting. And I think this just motivates that because it's really cool. And yeah, it's just going to keep growing, which is great. So if you've enjoyed the video, please do let us know. Thank you to the Squarebase Patreons, and you can join us there with our ever-growing, terrifying community of Patreons if you would like to.
They will get reinvigorated. A big part of what I've been working on recently too is getting my stuff in a row for 2025 for running events. So just a little hint, skidoodle. SBot 3 we'll just tease SBot 3 at this point. We're just teasing.
Okay, perfect. Well, listen, love you all. See you all soon. Take care of yourselves. Thanks very much. Stay square based and see you soon. Goodbye.